I'm a neurologist, and I specialize in complex, intractable pain and treatment-resistant depression. And I'm sorry I didn't get that information to the people who asked a week ago. I was traveling, and they asked for my photo and information. I previously taught at UCLA Epilepsy Center. I did research on chronophysiology, which is cycles and seizures, and then taught at UCLA Anesthesiology Pain Center, which used to be interdisciplinary, and then they pretty much closed across the country in '91. So only a small number of interdisciplinary pain centers that still exist. They simply don't make money for the university. So what UCLA did was they took the only therapeutic swimming pool in Los Angeles and they covered it over so that they could put up their 12th X-ray unit or something like that. And then I was invited to teach cancer pain at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and I came back in the mid-90s to Santa Monica, and I realized since '91 the whole movement to use opiates for the treatment of chronic pain had been growing, and I only knew opiates for cancer pain. And so I excluded a lot of people so I could get a very pure sense, like no litigated cases. Tried to exclude secondary gain so I could really get a sense of what opiates did, and I was disappointed because patients on very high doses still had severe pain. And as you all know, there's been from nothing, no opiates for chronic pain, to a peak, and then little did I know until this year how very severe the addiction epidemic of opiate addiction and deaths swept across the country in rural as well as cities, and kills so many thousands of people every year. And CDC took it in their own hands and yanked down the dose, and that's just a beginning. Unfortunately, they don't cover a lot of things for pain that I use. That is to say, insurance companies don't, because what I found works, a couple of different systems that are non-opiate systems. Many of them have to be compounded, and right now almost no insurance covers compounding. And who can afford that? It's several $100s a month cash out of pocket just for the medications. So even if I stabilize someone and get them on refills for 4 months and see them every 4 months, the cost is horrible. And then other meds, Lyrica, it's hard to get approved. You have to do a prior authorization. These are all roadblocks. They insist on gabapentin. I did a piece on my website a few months ago this summer on NNT, stands for number needed to treat. And it turns out, and this was this was just an outline of an article that was published by some very prestigious professors in Denmark. So they reviewed the entire literature, put it together, and found and published the results. So for one person to respond to gabapentin, which is pretty much required by all insurance carriers before you go forward, you need 7.2 people for one to respond. That's the number needed to treat. And that's huge. And almost everyone's on it. And then they remain on it, whether it works or not, for decades. So basically, I'm looking at other systems besides opiates because I say to patients, if your pain is severe and you're on opiates, what is it really doing? We know opiates relieve anxiety. So if the opiate only brings your pain down a couple points from severe to less severe, is that just because it's relieving anxiety? Because we know relief of anxiety will relieve pain. Well, think about tapering off, because these other systems are very important, and one of them has to do with the innate immune system called glia. And I'm very grateful, thanks to the RSD Association, Mr. Broach and the association invited me to a glial conference where they had brought the world's foremost glial specialists from everywhere. So I was one of a tiny number of MDs in this audience of hundreds in Chicago back in 2010. And then one of the board members, who's a professor in Seattle, came to my office in October 2010, and I spent 2 days introducing 8 of my patients to him, 4 of whom had been pain-free and continued to take low-dose naltrexone. And others only needed it for 1 month, decades of chronic pain gone. And then they stopped it and they remained pain-free, 4 of those. Now, what is low-dose naltrexone? That's one of the other alternate systems that I'm really impressed by. The Nobel Prize was given about 5 years ago for the discovery of just one receptor on that system, the TLR4 receptor, which activates the innate immune system. We didn't know about this in the brain. We have cells in the brain called the innate immune system. And for 100 years, we just thought they were glue. They just structural. They just held the neurons together. Turns out they are 85% of the volume in the brain. And they outnumber neurons 10 to 1. And they produce chemicals called cytokines. Now, so they produce anti-inflammatory cytokine, interleukin 10, and they produce pro-inflammatory cytokines. But you guys with chronic pain, you have too much of the pro-inflammatory, so you're out of balance. So one goal is to help restore balance, and low-dose naltrexone does that by modulating and reducing the pro-inflammatory cytokines. It may or may not be all you need, but for many patients, regardless of what is the cause of pain, wow. Now, there's a lot of mythology about low-dose naltrexone that says you can't give more than 4.5 milligrams. And it's one of the first things I posted on May 2609, 7 years ago on my website, which I started in April 09. And I connected with an NIH researcher who also told me about dextromethorphan. So low-dose naltrexone blocks the opiate. You can't give it in a person who's taking an opiate, or they will go into instant withdrawal. So if an addict overdoses, takes too much opiate, stops breathing, you give naloxone generally, but naltrexone is longer acting. So if someone has overdosed, naloxone, EMTs will inject. It may only last about 3 minutes. Naltrexone lasts a long time. And it turns out in patients with multiple sclerosis, where it was first used around 1985, that's an autoimmune disease of the central nervous system. Naltrexone acts very differently than others. They have to be very careful, start very, very low, and never, some of them don't get beyond 3 milligrams a day. I generally take patients up to 15 milligrams, 12.5. But there's this myth that says, including Stanford, that says you should never go above 4.5 milligrams because you're blocking endorphins in the brain. The brain makes its own opiate. So naltrexone blocks opiates. They're saying it blocks its own opiates in the brain, but the NIH professor said no. This was back in 2009. He said, no, it's not true. He measured endorphins in the 70s. They're very hard to measure. People attribute many things to endorphins, but it doesn't work on that system. It really modulates the inflammation. But people with MS can develop a lot of other symptoms. They have to go very slowly. Others, no, not so much. Another glial modulator of the innate immune system, which again is different from the immune system in the rest of the body, is PEA, palmitoyl ethanolamide, which I posted on several times in the last 3.5 years. And for a long time, many of my patients were importing it from the Netherlands, but now, since this year, we have a company, Vitalux, that makes it in this country, and they just sent me a sample Friday, which is a cream, PEA cream. It comes in a pump. It's about this big. It's a very good size, and I'm very impressed with the low price. I had a patient put it on externally She had, I'm not sure if she had a torn ligament, but near the brachioradialis, she had a really bad tender spot that was distracting her. She saw me for other chronic intractable pain of the spine, but I had her put some on this region, and within about 2 minutes, she was saying, wow. She was impressed. So I don't know. I have a patient in Brooklyn. I was recently privileged to be invited to see and treat. She's been bedridden 6 years with RSD. And from the age of 15, severe pain on high dose Dilaudid and prednisone. And as I say to most patients, please taper off before I see you. You can't, opiates cause inflammation. And we're going to be using medication that reduces inflammation. And thankfully, the family had started her on PEA several weeks before I arrived. And by the time I arrived, her pain had gone from severe down to mild moderate, just on the PEA. But she had also tapered off prednisone and Dilaudid. I was very impressed and pleased, because we never know. I simply look at complex pain, why spend a month here, a month there, a month there? You've already tried that with other things. Many of my patients come from long distance. We have 2 weeks, and I'm committed to do whatever I can in 2 weeks' time with very complicated multi-drug systems starting every other day. Just to get them started, because it takes about 3 weeks to get to an effective dose of a couple of these. And she was one of those who was not able to tolerate ketamine. And I want to say, ketamine is not an essential drug for RSD. It's not. There's a lot of fears about, oh my God, I can't tolerate it. She was crying and weeping. It's fine. I have patients who can't tolerate it, or who initially did tolerate it, but later on it stopped working. What do you do then? Well, that's where all these others come into play. And besides, ketamine is a short-acting drug. Why give it if you're on opiates that are causing more inflammation, which cause more pain? So I prescribe ketamine in a nasal spray or sublingual because it's short-acting. But I think the others are maybe more important than the ketamine, certainly for others. And I do see occasional children as young as 8 with RSD or in treatment-resistant depression or bipolar depressed. I see those, but mostly adult practice. So instead of ketamine, I started her on memantine, which is a drug for Alzheimer's, which also blocks the NMDA receptor. So ketamine blocks the NMDA receptor. It's different from the opiate system, but around the year 2001 in France, they published showing people with RSD have a profound increase in the number of NMDA receptors all over the brain. And by giving this drug, memantine, the brand name in this country is Namenda, memantine blocks that receptor. They were able to reduce pain, and all these excess receptors were restored to normal number. And that's when I first started using it in the early 2000s for intractable pain of all kinds. Now, RSD is nerve pain, but the pain systems, which are very complicated, are not specific for RSD. And nerve pain, as you probably know, is more difficult to treat than any other kind of pain. It's especially, we don't know why, worse at night. So it keeps you awake. And sleep is important for pain relief, as well as restoring other functions such as glia. What do the glia do when you go to sleep? We now know from University of Rochester, there are these channels in the brain, and instead of lymphatic systems that bring things bring waste up to the heart and functions to be purified, the glial channels open very wide. And if you sleep in a certain position, especially lying on your left side or your right side, but not front or back, the brain is able to get rid of things that accumulate for Alzheimer's disease. Yeah. And there was a 3-day conference on migraine in San Francisco recently. Everyone flew in from all over the world, very distinguished speakers. And the speaker who did that research from Stony Brook, I think it was, in Long Island, SUNY, was just swarmed with researchers at the end of the conference, brilliant research showing the brain does have a glymphatic system that gets rid of stuff that you don't want up there. Glia are very interesting. So PEA and low-dose naltrexone are glial modulators. They modulate the inflammation, help to restore balance, restore normal. The other system, the NMDA system, ketamine, memantine, another drug besides those, we used to think dextromethorphan worked to block the NMDA receptor. Turns out it doesn't, or only minimally. It does what I looked for years. It reduces the explosive hyperproduction of glutamate, which is the excitatory transmitter in the brain. Glutamate goes over to the NMDA receptor, makes this big Goomba, and floods that neuron with calcium, which can kill the neuron. So you get brain atrophy and memory loss in people who have chronic pain. And we also know that's true in people with depression. Well, I should say probably rats with depression. They take this work was done at Yale. I posted about it about 3 years ago in the fall. They within IMH showed if you take rats and you make them very depressed and they sit in the corner and they don't run their wheel, which they like to do for hours. Thank you. We're about time. Is that what you're saying? Good, thanks. And they found that when you slice and dice the brain, inflammation. And now we know in young teens who have schizophrenia, their first signs of schizophrenia, they find neuroinflammation in them. So hopefully we will someday develop more methods to reduce inflammation of the brain, which can be very harmful, creating pain, and probably a whole system of disorders called gliopathies. Possibly Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, multiple sclerosis, cancer, autoimmune disease, and so on. These glia are the innate immune system. They're very powerful. Thank you.